Mr. Thompson grinned mischievously, his eyes scanning the room filled with students. "All right, class," he said, writing a complex calculus problem on the board. "Let's see if anyone can solve this." The class chuckled, knowing the problem was far beyond them. But then, with a sly grin, he turned to Jerry, the school janitor, and dared, "Jerry, how about you give it a shot?" The room burst into laughter, thinking it was a joke. But to their shock, Jerry stepped forward, picked up the chalk, and said, "I'm not here to clean. I'm here to teach." The room fell silent. Hey, story family, welcome back, and thank you for tuning in today. You're in for a mind-blowing story that's packed with drama, unexpected twists, and an unforgettable lesson. Before I dive into the story, kindly comment the city you're watching from and your best math topic. I know you will smile. Okay, endeavor to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. Now, let's begin. It was a quiet, normal morning at Willowbrook High School, a day just like any other. The sun was barely peeking through the high windows of the classroom, and the students shuffled in, slowly finding their seats, their voices low as they discussed everything from the latest sports game to the homework they had barely managed to finish. Mr. Thompson, the math teacher, was at the front of the room, flipping through his notes, preparing for the day's lesson. His reputation was well known in the school. Not only was he a math genius, but he also had a way of making every lesson feel like a new adventure. He had an easygoing attitude that kept the students entertained, but his mind was sharp, and everyone knew it. Today, however, he had something different in mind. "All right, class," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes twinkling as he looked over the students, who were still buzzing with low conversation. "I've got something special planned for you today." A few students raised their eyebrows, intrigued, as the usual chatter began to die down. Mr. Thompson had a way of getting everyone's attention without raising his voice. He tapped his pen against the edge of the desk, his smile widening as he set the stage. "I know you've all been working hard on vector calculus," he said, leaning casually against the desk. "But I want to see if anyone really gets it. So I'm going to challenge you." The room quieted completely. Mr. Thompson loved his challenges. He made them fun, but they were never easy. And so, the students braced themselves for whatever twist was coming. "You all think this is tough stuff, right?" He motioned toward the whiteboard. "Well, here's the deal. I'm going to put up a vector calculus problem, and I'm going to see if one of you can solve it in front of the class." The students exchanged unsure glances. The problem on the board was going to be tough. They knew it. Even the brightest of them, like Sarah and Thomas, looked at each other in doubt. Mr. Thompson smiled at the growing nervousness in the air. "I'll tell you what," he continued, his voice dropping slightly as he leaned forward with a wink. "If none of you can solve it, maybe I'll ask someone else. Maybe someone who's been working in this school for years, but is never asked to do anything academic." A chuckle went through the class, though it wasn't sure what to expect next. That was until they saw Mr. Thompson's gaze shift to the door. "Jerry," he called out, his voice just loud enough to be heard by the whole class. The door creaked open slowly, and Jerry, the school janitor, stepped inside. He was an older man, around 50 years old, with thick glasses and a slightly hunched back from years of cleaning floors and scrubbing walls. His uniform was faded, and he always had a mop or bucket in hand, quietly going about his job, never speaking much to the students. He was a figure that most of them barely noticed, except when they saw him doing his daily rounds. The room grew silent. "Jerry, can you come up here and solve this problem for us?" Mr. Thompson asked casually, his smile playful. "I'm sure the students would love to see how the janitor does with a little math challenge." Laughter rippled through the class. Some students snickered. Others looked at each other in disbelief. Jerry, the janitor, was being asked to solve a complex calculus problem. It felt like a joke. Everyone knew that Jerry was kind and polite, but didn't strike anyone as the academic type. He cleaned, mopped, and never spoke about anything academic. The idea of him solving this tough problem seemed impossible, almost laughable. But Jerry didn't smile. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, scanning the board. His expression was unreadable. He didn't seem nervous, didn't look embarrassed by the laughter in the room. Instead, he walked to the front of the class slowly and deliberately, as if this were just another part of his routine. The students exchanged confused glances. "Are you sure, Jerry?" Mr. Thompson asked with a playful glint in his eyes. Jerry didn't answer right away. He just took a deep breath, placed his hands on the chalk, and began to write on the board. He wrote out the problem, looked at it, and then continued to work through the steps. At first, no one said a word. They all watched in stunned silence as Jerry moved his chalk across the board, making calculations and drawing vectors that none of them could fully understand. His movements were precise, confident, and steady. It wasn't the hurried scribble of someone who was unsure of the answer. It was the fluid motion of someone who had done this many times before. One student leaned over to another and whispered, "Is he really solving this?" The other student nodded in confusion, watching intently. The laughter from earlier was gone now, replaced by a deep, eerie silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. Mr. Thompson's face grew serious, his amusement fading as he watched Jerry work. His eyes widened as the janitor's methodical steps took him through the problem faster than any of the students had expected. Jerry wasn't just writing down random numbers. He was solving the problem, and he was doing it flawlessly. The class sat there, their mouths slightly open, unable to look away. They had no idea how Jerry, the janitor, could be doing this. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next period. The students filed out of the classroom, still chuckling about Mr. Thompson's joke. They were amused, talking among themselves about how ridiculous the idea was. Jerry, the janitor, solving a vector calculus problem. Everyone thought it was just a playful challenge, a harmless bit of fun. But as the last of the students made their way to the door, something unexpected happened. The door opened again. Jerry, the janitor, stood in the doorway, his figure filling the frame. His usual routine of mopping floors and cleaning hallways seemed distant now. This time, he wasn't holding a mop or a bucket. He stood there silently, his face as serious as the students had ever seen it. Gone was the soft smile, the gentle nod when students said hello. His eyes were sharp, focused, and there was no trace of the usual humdrum janitor the students had grown accustomed to. The class froze. The sound of shuffling footsteps and the rustling of bags stopped immediately. Jerry stepped inside, his shoes making soft taps against the linoleum floor. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to him, curiosity growing in their chests like a thick fog. No one moved. No one spoke. Without a word, Jerry walked up to the whiteboard. His eyes locked on the problem Mr. Thompson had written. The entire class watched in disbelief. There was no joking, no lighthearted atmosphere now. Jerry, the janitor, was staring at a complex vector calculus equation, something that had stumped even some of the brightest students in the class, and he wasn't backing down. His hands, rough and calloused from years of manual labor, gripped the chalk with surprising steadiness. The students sat in silence, exchanging quick, confused glances. Was this part of the joke? Was Jerry just going to erase the equation and walk out? But Jerry didn't say a word. He simply took a deep breath and began. His chalk moved across the board with surprising elegance, his strokes confident, deliberate. Every line he drew, every calculation he made, was as smooth as if he had been doing it for years. The class remained still, watching as Jerry worked through the steps with absolute precision. His handwriting, usually rushed when he was writing out school reminders or mopping instructions, was now clean and sharp. His movements were methodical, each one calculated. He drew vectors, calculated angles, moved between different forms of the equation, and solved parts that had the students' heads spinning earlier. It was clear that Jerry wasn't just guessing or making it up as he went along. He knew exactly what he was doing. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft scraping of chalk against the board, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of a student shifting in their seat. It felt surreal. This wasn't a joke. Jerry wasn't pretending to solve it. He was solving it. Sarah, one of the smartest students in the class, leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. Is he really solving it? She whispered to Thomas beside her. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes glued to the board. Paul, a classmate sitting toward the back, rubbed his eyes, thinking he was seeing things. Jerry? The janitor. This didn't make sense. Was it possible that all this time, Jerry had been quietly sitting on a treasure trove of knowledge that no one knew about? Was it possible that his simple, humble demeanor had been hiding a brilliant mind? Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson stood frozen by the desk, his usual playful demeanor replaced with one of shock. His arms were crossed, but even from the front of the room, the students could see his expression change. The confidence in his eyes slowly melted away into disbelief as he watched Jerry work through the complex calculus problem. Each step taken with a calm precision that seemed to make perfect sense. The equation that Mr. Thompson had written just to challenge his class, to show them how tough calculus could be, was now being solved flawlessly by someone they had always underestimated. The students exchanged more looks, this time with a sense of unease creeping in. Was this real? How could Jerry, of all people, be doing this? Was it even possible? The entire class was still, with only the sound of Jerry's chalk filling the room. The laughter that had followed Mr. Thompson's challenge now seemed a distant memory. Jerry paused for a moment, scanning the board with a sharp eye. The class leaned forward collectively, holding their breath. He wasn't finished yet. With one final stroke, Jerry completed the last part of the equation. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his uniform, and looked up at the class. The room was eerily silent. Mr. Thompson, his usual confident smirk wiped from his face, slowly stepped forward. He didn't know what to say. He looked at Jerry, then at the board, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The students stared at the equation, their eyes darting between Jerry and the complex symbols on the board. Is this real? Mr. Thompson finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jerry nodded slowly. He didn't look smug or proud, just tired, as though solving this was just another day at the office. His quiet voice broke the silence. I didn't just solve it. I've been doing this for years. The room felt like it was going to explode. How could this be? The janitor, who had never been anything more than a shadow in the hallways, who barely spoke to anyone, had just done the impossible. The tension in the room grew thick. Was Jerry really solving it, or was this some kind of trick? Jerry finished the last stroke of chalk on the board and stood back, his hand slowly lowering to his sides. The students sat in stunned silence, their eyes glued to the equations, then darting up to Jerry. His chest rose and fell with calm, steady breaths, but his expression was somber. He didn't expect applause. He didn't expect anything but the quiet that now filled the room like a heavy fog. The class was paralyzed, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded in front of them. They had thought it was a joke. They thought Mr. Thompson's challenge was just that, a joke. But Jerry had solved it. Every step, every calculation, every vector. It was flawless, and the realization was dawning on them. This wasn't a prank. Jerry had just solved a complex calculus problem that no one in the class, not even the brightest students, had expected to crack. Mr. Thompson, whose face had slowly drained of color, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he wiped his brow. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. You actually solved it," Mr. Thompson stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His tone was a mixture of awe and disbelief. I didn't expect this." Jerry turned to face the class, and for the first time since he'd walked in, A small, humble smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of pride. It was something more fragile, more intimate, almost sad. He didn't seem thrilled by the attention, but rather resigned to the moment. "I didn't just solve it," Jerry said softly, his voice low and steady. "I taught myself how to solve these kinds of problems years ago." He paused, looking out at the students who had been laughing and whispering moments before. "I've been studying math on my own for a long time." The word hung in the air, and for the first time, the class seemed to breathe in unison, processing the revelation that had just shattered every assumption they had about Jerry. The janitor, the quiet man who had always swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and kept the school running behind the scenes. They had never thought twice about him. But now, standing there, he wasn't just the janitor. He was someone entirely different. Jerry didn't stop. He looked down, as though gathering the strength to say what he had carried inside for so long. "I may be the janitor here," he continued, his voice cracking just slightly, "but I have a degree in mathematics." The silence that followed felt suffocating. The students' mouths fell open. Their eyes widened with shock and disbelief. They looked at each other, unsure if they had heard Jerry correctly. A janitor, a mathematician. How could that be? Jerry's gaze softened as he looked out at the students, as if he had expected this exact reaction. "I lost my job as a professor years ago," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pain that seemed to resonate through the room. His hands rested at his sides, but they looked heavy, as if they carried more than just the burden of the day's work. "My life changed. I had to do something to survive, so I took the janitor job. I never wanted to let go of my love for math, though. I continued to study in the evenings on my own." It was the first time anyone had heard Jerry's story, the first time they had glimpsed the life that had led him here, into this very classroom. The room, once filled with laughter and disbelief, now felt somber. The students could see the weight of his words. The reality of the situation hit them like a wave. They had all assumed Jerry was just the janitor, the invisible worker who kept the school running. They had dismissed him, laughed at him, joked about his abilities. But they were wrong. The class was now filled with a strange mixture of shock, guilt, and admiration. They had judged him by his job, by his appearance, without ever considering what he might have been capable of. They had laughed at him, assuming he knew nothing about math. But now, they saw him in an entirely new light. The janitor wasn't just a man who swept floors. He was a man who had fallen from the world he had once loved, teaching math, and had spent years in silence, burying his passion beneath the mundane tasks of daily life. Mr. Thompson, still standing in front of the class, was the first to break the silence. His voice was thick, almost apologetic. "Jerry, I'm so sorry," he said, his eyes downcast. "I never knew. I never took the time to ask. You're more than just a janitor." Jerry's smile returned, but it was fleeting. He nodded, his expression calm but reflective. "It's all right, Mr. Thompson. I'm just a man doing what I have to do." But the truth was far more than that. Jerry had spent years hiding his talents, his knowledge, his true identity. The janitor was no longer just the janitor. He was someone who had been broken by life, forced to abandon his dreams to survive. Yet, against all odds, he had held on to his passion, his love for mathematics, and had continued to learn, to grow, and to challenge himself. The next day, Jerry wasn't at his usual spot sweeping the hallways or mopping the floors. For the first time in a long time, the students found themselves missing the quiet janitor who had always been there, always in the background, never asking for anything more than the simplest of greetings. The absence left a strange feeling in the air, as though something important was missing. The class buzzed with conversation, and the students could hardly stop talking about what had happened the day before. Some of them felt guilty. They had laughed at Jerry when Mr. Thompson had called him into the class, assuming he knew nothing. Some of them had even whispered behind his back. But now, The truth was impossible to ignore. Jerry had shown them all up, not with arrogance or pride, but with quiet humility and an unexpected brilliance. He had proven them all wrong, and they knew it. The words, "I have a degree in mathematics," echoed in their minds over and over again. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. The door to the classroom opened, and there stood Jerry again. But this time, he wasn't wearing his faded janitor's uniform, holding a mop or a bucket. He stood there tall, with a new energy about him, a new purpose in his stride. It wasn't the shuffle of a man who had spent years cleaning floors. It was the walk of someone who had regained a part of himself that had been buried for too long. He stood before the class, and this time, there was no mop in his hands. He was ready to teach. "I'm not here to clean today," Jerry said with a slight, knowing smile. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable confidence in it. "I'm here to teach." The students sat in stunned silence for a few moments. They weren't sure if this was a joke or if Jerry was truly serious. But there was something about the way he stood, the way he looked at them, that told them this wasn't just some impromptu lesson. Jerry was here to share something important, and he wasn't going to back down. Without further hesitation, Jerry walked to the front of the room and picked up a piece of chalk. He began to write on the board, drawing vector equations and breaking them down in a way that made sense. The students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. This wasn't the abstract, intimidating calculus they had been struggling with. Jerry had a way of simplifying things, of making them understandable, of showing how math wasn't just a series of equations to memorize. It was a tool, a way to understand the world around them. He showed them how vectors could be used to describe motion, how they could represent forces in physics, how they were everywhere in nature, from the angles of a tree branch to the speed of a moving car. He connected every concept to something real, something they could touch, see, or feel. And as Jerry taught, he didn't just impart knowledge. He instilled a sense of wonder. It was as if he was revealing a hidden language of the universe, one that was accessible to everyone, if only they looked at it the right way. By the end of the lesson, the students were engaged, asking questions, participating in discussions. It wasn't like any other class they had ever had. The numbers on the board no longer felt like arbitrary symbols. They felt like keys to understanding something bigger than themselves. They had learned about vector calculus, yes, but they had also learned something far more important. As Jerry finished explaining a particularly tricky concept, he turned to face the class, his smile now warm and genuine. Math isn't about memorizing formulas. It's about understanding. It's about seeing the world from different angles and discovering patterns you didn't notice before. The students looked at each other, their eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and surprise. They had expected a lesson in math, sure, but they hadn't expected a lesson in life, one that would stick with them far longer than any equation. "And remember," Jerry added, his voice softening as he looked out at them, "never underestimate anyone. You never know who might be hiding their brilliance behind something as simple as a mop." The class, for the first time, erupted into applause. It wasn't just for the lesson in math. It was for the lesson in humility, in respect, and in understanding the true worth of someone, regardless of their job, their past, or how others saw them. Jerry's story had transformed from a quiet, humble janitor to a man who had taught them something they would never forget. But there was still more to come. As the students gathered their things, they noticed a subtle change in Jerry. There was something in his eyes, a spark. When the class ended and the students filed out, one of the parents, Mrs. Harris, approached Jerry. She had been in the classroom during the lesson and had seen the transformation in her child's eyes. She was impressed, inspired by what Jerry had taught her own son. After a few minutes of conversation, Mrs. Harris came to him with an offer. "I have a connection at MIT," she said, her voice steady. "You could teach there. I can help make it happen." Jerry looked at her, his face softening. "I've been out of the teaching game for years. I'm not sure. You're not just a janitor. Mrs. Harris interrupted gently. You've shown you've got the knowledge and the heart to teach. You deserve this chance. The next day, the students, in a move that surprised everyone, came together to throw Jerry a birthday celebration. It was his special day, and they wanted to make sure it was one he would never forget. With the help of their parents, they organized a small party right in the classroom, complete with decorations, cake, and a heartfelt card from every student. And as they sang "Happy Birthday," Jerry was overwhelmed. He hadn't expected anything like this, but there it was, a group of students, his students, giving him a moment of recognition he had never imagined. And the surprises didn't stop there. Later that week, Jerry received a letter from MIT, a formal invitation to teach university students there at double the salary he had ever earned as a professor before. The twist of fate had come full circle, and Jerry had been given a second chance, one he hadn't dared dream about. The students had witnessed the transformation of a janitor into a teacher, and now they had seen the birth of a new chapter in his life. Jerry's story became one of the most talked about events in the school's history. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought, and stay tuned for more incredible stories just like this one. Thank you for being part of the story family.